Marshall, the most influential figure in American legal history, was born on September 24, 1755, in Germantown, Virginia, now Midland, Virginia. He was the eldest of 15 children. The son of Thomas and Mary Isham Keith Marshall, his family was of humble means but with a proud lineage. His father, a planner and militia officer, was an influential figure in Virginia. His mother, devoted to her children, was in charge of the home. From his parents, young Marshall gained valuable character traits: integrity, high morals, the pursuit of knowledge, and a commitment to public service. Marshall began his early education at home, where his father provided him with a solid initial base. He then received private tutoring from a Scottish Presbyterian minister, Reverend Archibald Campbell. Under Campbell's guidance, Marshall was formally introduced to mathematics, history, and literature. He later attended an academy in Westmoreland County. The academy, like many educational institutions of the time, focused on classical studies and provided students with a broad knowledge base. Marshall studied Latin, Greek, and immersed himself in the study of classical literature and philosophy. He became well-versed in the works of renowned thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. The exposure to classical education greatly influenced his intellectual development, strengthening his reasoning abilities, ethical principles, and triggering a passion for the law. The academy combined classrooms and books with physical activities and military training, fostering discipline, leadership, and a sense of duty. These qualities would later manifest during the American Revolutionary War. Despite his family's prominence, Marshall's upbringing was relatively modest. John Marshall's childhood was marked by a strong sense of community and close-knit family ties. The family lived in a log cabin and emphasized the importance of hard work and self-reliance. His father's proximity to figures like George Washington and his involvement in local politics exposed Marshall to the sacrifices made by his fellow countrymen for the cause of independence. These early experiences fueled his future commitment to the principles of liberty and justice. While John Marshall's childhood was marked by the growing tensions between the colonies and Britain, it was also a time of opportunity and growth. The path up the social ladder was reachable to most people. A trade, some grit, hard work, and a reasonable lineage in the colonies, perhaps spanning 2 generations, all qualified for status in mid-18th century America. The vast lands of the American frontier presented endless possibilities for those with the drive and ambition to seize them. With land came status and prosperity. The Marshalls fit the bill. At the age of 14, Marshall suffered the loss of his father, and became responsible for helping his mother manage the household. Marshall displayed resilience and determination, taking on various odd jobs to support his family. The role assumed, as the quasi-head of the house, taught him the value of hard work and self-reliance, shaping his character and instilling in him a sense of maturity and leadership. When Marshall was 19, the American Revolution exploded. Once the call for volunteers came to Virginia in May 1775, he immediately enlisted in the Continental Army. Partly in recognition of his family name, he was appointed lieutenant. Marshall began instructing volunteers, many of whom were younger than him. He seemed the right type to be a leader. He was tall for his time, perhaps 6 feet or a little more, but he walked upright, so his slim build was not so apparent. He had a large face, a ruddy complexion, and intense eyes. He wore distinctive clothing, a purple hunting shirt, matching pants with white fringe, and a black, round hat. During the war, Marshall endured the harsh winter at Valley Forge and fought in several battles, including the famous Battle of Brandywine. Marshall's military service provided him with invaluable insights into the challenges and the sacrifices endured by the Patriots. He witnessed firsthand the ideals that drove the movement, freedom and self-government. The war influenced his commitment to justice, preparing him for his later role as a defender of constitutional principles. His father's passing and later the Revolutionary War disrupted Marshall's formal studies. However, his education, much like other prominent figures of the time, was not limited to the classroom alone. A keen intellect and an insatiable curiosity made him largely self-taught, delving into various subjects, including history, politics, and philosophy. After the war, Marshall decided for a career in law. He attended the College of William and Mary and studied under the guidance of his mentor, George Wythe, a prominent Virginia attorney, judge, and signer of the Declaration of Independence. Under Wythe's guidance, Marshall honed his skills in critical thinking, logical reasoning, and persuasive argumentation. In 1780, Marshall was admitted to the bar and commenced his legal work in Fauquier County, Virginia. Marshall's versatility as a lawyer was one of his defining traits. Throughout his career, he successfully tackled a wide array of cases, spanning various areas of law, including criminal, civil, and appellate matters. His ability to navigate and excel in different branches of law showcased his exceptional legal acumen and adaptability. His success in the courtroom made him one of the preeminent lawyers in Virginia, and earned him the respect of his peers and the admiration of his clients. In criminal cases, Marshall exhibited a deep understanding of criminal law and procedure. He analyzed complex legal issues, examined evidence meticulously, and crafted persuasive arguments to defend or prosecute his clients. In civil cases, Marshall demonstrated a comprehensive grasp of civil law principles. Whether it was contract disputes, property matters, or tort claims, he applied his legal knowledge to dissect intricate legal issues and construct compelling arguments. Marshall's ability to anticipate opposing arguments and counter them effectively made him a formidable opponent in the courtroom. Marshall's prowess extended to appellate matters as well. As an appellate advocate, he showcased his exceptional ability to distill complex legal arguments into concise and persuasive briefs. His keen legal mind allowed him to identify key legal issues, research precedents thoroughly, and present his arguments in a logical and convincing manner. His skills in appellate advocacy were later reflected in his influential opinions as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Marshall's foray into politics began in 1782 when he was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates. He quickly demonstrated his aptitude for public service and legislative matters. His astute observations and passionate advocacy for individual rights caught the attention of the Founding Fathers, who recognized his potential as a rising star in American politics. In 1788, Marshall represented Virginia at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, where he played a pivotal role in advocating for the adoption of the U.S. Constitution. In 1797, President John Adams appointed Marshall as the United States Secretary of State. In that post, Marshall played a significant role in shaping American foreign policy and negotiations with France. His diplomatic skills and intellect proved invaluable in navigating the challenges of international relations during a crucial period in American history. Marshall's involvement in politics continued to grow, and he was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1799. As a congressman, he actively participated in debates. Marshall's knowledge of the law and his commitment to upholding constitutional principles were evident in his legislative work. Marshall's personal life also flourished. He married Mary Willis Ambler in 1783, and they had 10 children together. Marshall's dedication to his family was evident throughout his life. Marshall's enduring legacy lies in his tenure as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, a position he held for an unprecedented 34 years, from 1801 until his death in 1835. As Chief Justice, Marshall's impact on American jurisprudence was transformative. Throughout his tenure, Marshall authored numerous influential opinions characterized by a strict adherence to constitutional principles. He believed in the importance of a robust judiciary as a safeguard against tyranny and a protector of individual rights. Marshall believed in a strong central government and sought to strengthen the authority of the federal government as envisioned by the framers of the Constitution. He was a staunch advocate for national unity and the need for a cohesive federal system. Marshall's rulings consistently favored a broad interpretation of federal powers, particularly those enumerated in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which grants Congress the authority to legislate on specific matters. In understanding Marshall's principles and actions, it's critical to review his interactions with some key figures of the time. George Wythe played a pivotal role in shaping John Marshall's legal education and career. Wythe, a highly respected lawyer and judge in Virginia, became Marshall's mentor during his formative years. Wythe's teachings and guidance had a profound and lasting impact on Marshall, influencing his understanding of legal principles and constitutional law. Marshall studied under Wythe's tutelage in the late 1770s and early 1780s. Wythe's approach to legal education emphasized a thorough understanding of legal principles, rigorous analysis, and the development of sound reasoning skills. Wythe instilled in Marshall a deep appreciation for the importance of studying legal precedents, interpreting statute, and applying the law with precision. Under Wythe's mentorship, Marshall not only acquired knowledge of legal concepts but also learned the importance of ethical conduct and professionalism in the legal profession. Wythe's integrity and commitment to justice served as a role model for Marshall, shaping his own ethical standards and sense of duty as an attorney and later as a judge. Wythe's influence extended beyond the classroom. He exposed Marshall to influential legal texts, including the works of Sir William Blackstone, which laid the foundation for Marshall's understanding of English common law. Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England, widely regarded as a definitive legal reference, provided Marshall with a comprehensive overview of legal principles and their historical development. Wythe's emphasis on the importance of constitutional law left a lasting impression on Marshall. Wythe himself was a prominent advocate for the principles of limited government and individual rights, and he imparted these values to Marshall. This exposure to constitutional law during his time with Wythe likely contributed to Marshall's later commitment to upholding the Constitution as Chief Justice of the United States. Marshall's deep respect and admiration for Wythe remained throughout his life. When Marshall's legal career began to flourish, he made a point of acknowledging Wythe's impact on his success, recognizing him as a guiding force in his development as a lawyer and jurist. James Madison, often referred to as the "Father of the Constitution," had a profound influence on John Marshall's thinking and approach to constitutional interpretation. Their close friendship and shared political ideals fostered a strong intellectual bond between the two men. Marshall and Madison first met during the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1788, where they worked together to convince their fellow Virginians to adopt the newly proposed Constitution. Both men argued passionately for a unified nation. Madison's deep understanding of constitutional principles and his role in drafting the Constitution greatly impressed Marshall and solidified their friendship. Madison's contributions to the Federalist Papers, a collection of essays advocating for the ratification of the Constitution, further shaped Marshall's understanding of the document's intent and purpose. The Federalist Papers, authored by Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, provided a comprehensive analysis of the Constitution's provisions and the principles underlying it. Marshall closely studied these essays, internalizing them and understanding their reasoning. Marshall's close association with Madison had a lasting impact on his judicial philosophy, particularly in relation to the interpretation of the Constitution. Marshall and, at the time Madison, believed in a strong federal government, and saw the Constitution as a fundamental and enduring framework deserving interpretation. This perspective guided Marshall's rulings during his tenure as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. To note, in later years, after the signing of the Constitution, Madison deviated from the perspective of a strong government and fully aligned with his mentor, Thomas Jefferson, joining the Republican Party in favoring states' rights. George Washington also played a significant role in shaping John Marshall's life and career. Marshall held Washington in high regard, considering him a personal hero and a guiding influence in his own pursuit of public service. Marshall's connection with Washington began during the Revolutionary War when Marshall served as a soldier in the Continental Army. As a young officer, he witnessed Washington's leadership and was inspired by the general's unwavering commitment to the cause of American independence. Marshall greatly respected Washington's military prowess and his quick and subtle decision-making. Most of all, he admired Washington for having, contrary to all expectations, successfully led an army against the most formidable military force of the age. After the war, Marshall continued to seek guidance from Washington. They developed a close personal relationship, with Marshall frequently visiting Mount Vernon, Washington's estate in Virginia. Their interactions extended beyond casual visits, as they engaged in discussions on matters of governance, law, and the future of the nation. Washington's moral character and integrity deeply impressed Marshall. He saw Washington as the embodiment of virtue and selflessness in public service. Marshall believed that Washington's leadership and dedication to the nation's welfare set a standard for all future leaders to emulate. This admiration for Washington's character and principles influenced Marshall's own sense of duty and commitment to upholding the ideals of the young republic. Washington's support and recognition were instrumental in Marshall's rise in the legal and political spheres. In 1789, Washington appointed Marshall as the United States Attorney for the District of Virginia, recognizing his legal acumen and his commitment to justice. This appointment marked a significant milestone in Marshall's career and provided him with invaluable experience in federal law. Marshall's admiration for Washington extended to his judicial philosophy as well. As Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Marshall also viewed the Constitution as the cornerstone to a united nation. Marshall, much like Washington, believed that the federal government required a broad interpretation of its powers to effectively govern and protect the interests of the American people. Marshall went as far as writing a biography of Washington. This historic document, named The Life of Washington, is a 5-volume series written posthumously. It won immediate appraisal as Marshall was a contemporary as well as a reliable source. Furthermore, the fact that Marshall had received from Washington's family diaries and records rendered credibility to the full content. Alexander Hamilton, one of the major founding fathers, had a profound influence on John Marshall's thinking and political philosophy. Marshall greatly admired Hamilton and his contributions to the nation, particularly his Federalist ideas on government and constitutional interpretation. Hamilton's writings, particularly his contributions to the Federalist Papers, deeply resonated with Marshall. The Federalist Papers, a Hamilton creation, was a series of essays written by Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, which became instrumental in the adoption of the United States Constitution. In these essays, Hamilton articulated his views on a strong central government, the importance of federal power, and the need for a robust judiciary. These ideas would have a lasting impact on Marshall's understanding of the Constitution and his approach to constitutional interpretation. Marshall, like Hamilton, believed in a broad interpretation of federal powers and a strong central government. He saw the Constitution as a living document that should be adapted to the changing needs of the nation. This aligned with Hamilton's belief that the Constitution should be a flexible instrument capable of addressing new challenges and advancing the welfare of the nation. Hamilton's influence on Marshall can be seen in several Supreme Court landmark cases where Marshall favored federal laws over state laws for the benefit of a unified nation. Marshall's admiration for Hamilton extended beyond his political ideas. He also respected Hamilton's intellect, legal acumen, and financial expertise. He recognized Hamilton as a brilliant lawyer and statesman, and he drew inspiration from Hamilton's ability to articulate complex ideas and persuade others through his eloquence. Thomas Jefferson also played a role in Marshall's career, although from a different perspective. Jefferson had a strained relationship with Marshall. Their conflict highlighted tensions during the early years of nationhood. Issues at play included the balance between federal and state sovereignty, the separation of powers, and the ongoing debate over constitutional interpretation that persists in the United States legal system today. Thomas Jefferson advocated for a limited government and a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson championed state sovereignty. He viewed the Supreme Court as an inferior branch of government, even acquiescent to the office of the president. This stand became apparent during his presidency, in essence contradicting his idea of limited federal authority. Marshall considered the Supreme Court to have an active role in safeguarding the rights and powers of the federal government and viewed the Constitution as a live and evolving document that needed interpretation according to events and situations. It was Marshall that elevated the judiciary to an equal footing with the other branches of government. The conflict reached its climax in the landmark case of Marbury v. Madison. This case established the principle of judicial review, which essentially granted the Supreme Court the power to validate or nullify laws based on their constitutionality. Jefferson vehemently opposed this interpretation of judicial power. He argued that the Constitution did not explicitly grant the Supreme Court the power of judicial review and believed that such power posed a threat to state sovereignty. Jefferson feared that Marshall's elastic interpretation would enable the federal government to exert excessive authority and undermine individual liberties. The conflict between Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall was not limited to the case of Marbury v. Madison. It extended to other key issues that shaped the early years of the United States, including the expansion of federal power, the nature of the Constitution, and the interpretation of the necessary and proper clause. One significant point of contention was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Jefferson believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. According to this, the federal government should have had no authority to acquire new territory. However, he bent his views in order to pursue the purchase. Nobody would now question that decision. It is ironic, though, that one of the major accomplishments for which Jefferson is known displays a total disregard for strict interpretation. Through the necessary and proper clause, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, he justified the constitutionality of his decision. Such a clause recognizes that the Constitution could not enumerate all possible instances where disagreement could ensue as the young nation embarked into uncharted territory. The necessary and proper clause served its purpose then and in many other instances throughout the years. Furthermore, their differences extended to the realm of foreign affairs. Jefferson favored a more isolationist approach, seeking to avoid entanglement in European conflicts, while Marshall advocated for a more active foreign policy that protected American interests abroad. This was evident in the case of the Nereid, 1815, where Marshall upheld the capture of a French vessel by American privateers during the War of 1812, asserting the authority of American privateers to act as quasi-naval forces. Jefferson outranked Marshall and tried to force his will on the judiciary. However, Marshall remained steadfast in his beliefs and through skill maneuvering checked Jefferson's advances. Had Jefferson imposed state sovereignty and his agrarian ideals, at the expense of the pursuit of a national identity and cohesiveness among the states, the United States might not have ended that united after all. Not an absurd assertion, given that Jefferson was only the third president and that the Constitution, just over 10 years old, had yet to be consolidated in practice as the law of the land. Marshall's actions solidifying the role of the Supreme Court as the final arbiter of constitutional interpretation, came at a critical moment to the survival of the nation. However, his contribution fails to be at a level with some of the more renowned founding fathers, such as the overrated Jefferson. As the fourth Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Marshall's influence on constitutional interpretation cannot be overstated. His judicial philosophy, which emphasized a strong central government and a broad interpretation of federal powers, shaped the court's jurisprudence and established important constitutional principles. His rulings, particularly in cases such as Marbury v. Madison, McCulloch v. Maryland and Gibbons v. Ogden, reinforced the supremacy of the Constitution and the authority of the federal government. Marshall's impact is still felt today, as his opinions continue to guide and inspire constitutional interpretation and the development of American jurisprudence. Marshall's most consequential case was Marbury v. Madison. This is the most emblematic case in United States history. It originated from a dispute that arose during the presidential transition of 1801. Outgoing President John Adams, on his last day in office, appointed several justices of the peace for the District of Columbia, including William Marbury. However, due to administrative complications, the commission was not delivered before Thomas Jefferson became president. Once Jefferson was president, he ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to turn over pending appointments, including Marbury's. Marbury sued in the Supreme Court, seeking an injunction to compel Madison to hand over his appointment. The case was heard by the Supreme Court in February 1803. Chief Justice John Marshall faced a difficult decision. For one thing, if they issued an order to deliver the appointments, the court could appear political and party-influenced. On the other hand, if they didn't act, the court might appear weak and powerless. Marshall took a strategic approach. The Supreme Court ruled that although Marbury was entitled to his appointment, the law on which he relied for legal remedy was unconstitutional. Marshall held that it went against the clause of the Constitution that established the limits of the jurisdiction of the court, and consequently could not issue the order that Marbury sought. Marbury v. Madison's landmark ruling was the first time that the Supreme Court invalidated an act of Congress based on its unconstitutionality. It established an important legal precedent, judicial review. It affirmed the Supreme Court's power as the final interpreter of the Constitution. It balanced powers between the judiciary and the other two branches of government, the executive and the legislative branch. Finally, it established the principle of judicial supremacy, which means that the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution has final and binding authority over all other branches of government, and therefore the power to strike down laws deemed unconstitutional. In the landmark case of McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819, Chief Justice John Marshall delivered a historic decision that had far-reaching implications for the balance of power between the federal government and the states. The case revolved around the constitutionality of the Second Bank of the United States and the power of the state of Maryland to tax the bank. The state of Maryland had imposed a tax on the Bank of the United States, seeking to hinder its operations and assert state sovereignty. James McCulloch, the cashier of the Baltimore branch of the bank, refused to pay the tax, prompting the case to be brought before the Supreme Court. Marshall's opinion in McCulloch v. Maryland had two significant outcomes. First, he upheld the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States, asserting that Congress had the authority to create such a bank under its implied powers. Marshall argued that the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution granted Congress the ability to enact laws that were necessary and appropriate to carry out its enumerated powers. He maintained that establishing a national bank was a reasonable means to fulfill Congress's power to regulate commerce and manage the nation's finances. Furthermore, Marshall declared that the state of Maryland did not have the power to tax the federal institution. He famously stated that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. He emphasized the supremacy of federal laws over state laws and asserted that the states could not impede or interfere with the functioning of federal institutions. Marshall's ruling established the principle that the federal government possessed certain implied powers beyond its expressly enumerated powers, and that state actions that obstructed or burdened these federal powers were unconstitutional. The decision in McCulloch v. Maryland had profound implications for the balance of power between the federal government and the states. It solidified the doctrine of implied powers, affirming that Congress possessed authority to enact laws that were reasonably related to its enumerated powers. This strengthened the scope of federal power and limited the ability of states to hinder federal institutions through taxes or other means. Beyond its immediate impact, the decision in McCulloch v. Maryland set important precedents in constitutional interpretation. It laid the foundation for the necessary and proper doctrine, which has been used to justify the expansion of federal power in subsequent cases. The ruling also solidified the notion of federal supremacy and provided a framework for resolving conflicts between federal and state laws. Moreover, Marshall's decision in McCulloch v. Maryland had a lasting impact on the development of American constitutional law. It contributed to the growth of federal power, particularly in areas related to finance, banking, and economic regulation. In Gibbons v. Ogden, 1824, Chief Justice John Marshall delivered a significant ruling that expanded the federal government's power over interstate commerce. The case centered around a dispute between two steamboat operators, Thomas Gibbons and Aaron Ogden, regarding their exclusive rights to operate steamboats in the waters between New York and New Jersey. Ogden held a state-granted monopoly license to operate steamboats in the region, while Gibbons operated under a federal coastal license. When Gibbons began offering steamboat services in competition with Ogden, the latter sought an injunction to prevent him from doing so, arguing that his state-granted monopoly should prevail. In his opinion, Marshall affirmed the authority of Congress to regulate interstate commerce and interpreted the Commerce Clause of the Constitution expansively. He concluded that the power to regulate commerce among the states belonged exclusively to the federal government and that state laws interfering with interstate commerce were unconstitutional. Marshall's ruling emphasized that interstate commerce encompassed not only the physical transportation of goods but also all commercial activities that substantially affected trade between states. This broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause set an important precedent, granting the federal government extensive regulatory powers over economic activities that crossed state lines. Marshall's reasoning in Gibbons v. Ogden drew heavily on the notion of a unified national economy. He argued that the Commerce Clause intended to eliminate trade barriers between states and promote economic integration across the nation. According to Marshall, the federal government had the authority to regulate all aspects of interstate commerce, including navigation and transportation. The decision in Gibbons v. Ogden had far-reaching implications for the future development of federal power. It established a framework for the federal government's regulatory authority in areas such as transportation, communications, and trade. Marshall's ruling laid the groundwork for subsequent court decisions that expanded federal power under the Commerce Clause, empowering Congress to enact legislation addressing various aspects of interstate commerce. Gibbons v. Ogden also highlighted Marshall's commitment to a strong central government and his belief in the primacy of federal law over conflicting state laws. The ruling reinforced the supremacy of federal authority and limited the ability of individual states to impede interstate commerce through conflicting regulations. In later years, the broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause established in Gibbons v. Ogden became a cornerstone of constitutional law. It provided a foundation for the expansion of federal power in areas such as civil rights, environmental regulation, and consumer protection. Other cases establishing the supremacy of the federal judiciary in interpreting the Constitution and ensuring the uniform application of federal law throughout the nation were cases such as Martin v. Hunters-Lessee, 1816, and Cohens v. Virginia, 1821. In cases like Fletcher v. Peck, 1810, and Dartmouth College v. Woodward, 1819, Marshall protected the sanctity of contracts and private property rights, ensuring that state legislatures could not impair these rights retroactively. These decisions bolstered the security of private investments and reinforced the stability of the legal system. Marshall's defense of contract rights had significant implications for economic development and investment. By establishing the principle that contracts are protected from impairment by state laws, Marshall created a legal framework that encouraged individuals and businesses to engage in contractual agreements with confidence. This stability and predictability in contractual relations fostered economic growth, as parties could rely on the enforcement of their contractual rights and obligations. It also reinforced the importance of property rights, as contracts often involve the transfer or utilization of property. Marshall's rulings helped establish a legal environment conducive to commerce, investment, and the overall prosperity of the nation. Marshall's rulings on federalism were guided by his belief in a strong and unified nation. He recognized the need for a central authority capable of addressing national issues and maintaining harmony among the states. At the same time, he acknowledged the importance of states as separate and sovereign entities, respecting their reserved powers under the 10th Amendment. Marshall's approach sought to strike a delicate balance, preserving both federal and state sovereignty within their respective spheres of influence. Marshall's approach, marked by his reliance on historical context and his commitment to maintaining the integrity of the Constitution, set a standard for future jurists. His opinions continue to be cited as authoritative sources of constitutional law and have shaped subsequent interpretations of the Constitution. The principles he established, such as judicial review, the necessary and proper clause, and the expansive interpretation of federal powers, remain fundamental to American constitutional jurisprudence. The expansion of federal power under Chief Justice John Marshall has indeed been a subject of criticism and debate. Marshall's broad interpretation of federal authority has been seen by some as a departure from the original intent of the framers of the Constitution and a threat to the principles of federalism and state sovereignty. They contend that Marshall's interpretation stretched the necessary and proper clause to encompass almost any measure that Congress viewed useful or beneficial, undermining the intended balance between federal and state authority. Critics argue that this decision set a precedent for an ever-expanding federal government at the expense of state sovereignty. In addressing critics, it is important to note that Marshall's expansion of federal power was not without justification. Marshall's decisions aimed to establish uniformity and consistency in the interpretation and application of federal law across the nation. By asserting federal authority, he sought to prevent states from impeding the operation of national institutions and to promote a cohesive national identity. His interpretations were often grounded in a broad reading of the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause of the Constitution. Marshall's posture should not be criticized without regards to the era when these events took place. At the time, without a strong central government, defending national unity and establishing nationally driven economic policies would have been next to impossible. This cannot be overlooked. Much of the debate that brought us to the signing of the Constitution centered around the balance of power between the states and the federal government. The Articles of Confederation had barely served its purpose during the War of Independence. Major shortcomings, like the inability to raise funds or provide supplies to Patriot forces, almost cost the war. After the Treaty of Paris, establishing American independence from Britain was signed in 1783, it became evident that unless drastic changes were implemented, the new nation was not going to survive. The Federalists essentially won the argument and the Constitution became the law of the land. Chief within its clauses were the explicit ability of the federal government to raise taxes and its implicit power to veto states' legislations. The implicit part created a gray area since there was no clear delineation between state and federal sovereignty. Major disagreements arising from this could have easily led to the failure of the American experiment, as much of Europe expected. Marshall single-handedly solved the impasse. Raising the judiciary to the level of both the legislative and executive, he made the Supreme Court final interpreter whenever the fuzziness in the Constitution offered no clear answer. John Marshall's contributions as a legal scholar, statesman, and Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court cemented his place in American history. The impact of Marshall's opinions extends beyond his own time. His legacy as a defender of the Constitution and the judiciary's role in preserving its integrity left a lasting impact on the structure of American government, and continues to shape the understanding and application of constitutional law in the United States.